You ever just look at a rock, or maybe a piece of metal, and wonder, what is this really made of? Like, way down deep. How do we actually peek inside a material to figure out its biggest secrets? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into right now. You know, this is the kind of fundamental mystery that scientists and engineers tackle every single day. And it's really two questions in one, right? First, what are the basic ingredients? And second, how are all those ingredients actually built? To get those answers, we need two totally different kinds of, let's call it, X-ray vision.
All right, so first up, let's meet the architect. This tool's whole job is to figure out the blueprint of a material. We're talking about X-ray diffraction, or XRD for short, and it is all about revealing that hidden internal structure.
So what is XRD exactly? Well, it's this incredibly powerful technique that lets us understand how atoms are arranged in anything that's, well, crystalline. And all crystalline means is that its atoms are stacked in a super neat, repeating 3D pattern, kind of like Legos or perfectly stacked bricks. We see this in metals, minerals, ceramics, even in some medicines. The cool part is, XRD doesn't just tell us what's there, it shows us the exact geometric pattern those atoms are locked into. Okay, but how does it actually work? Well, at the very heart of XRD is a principle called Bragg's law. Just imagine you're firing X-rays at a crystal. Inside that crystal, the atoms are all arranged in these perfectly spaced layers, kind of like shelves in a library. When the X-rays hit those layers, they bounce off, or diffract, in a really specific way. And by measuring the angle of that bounce, we can calculate the exact distance between those atomic shelves. It's almost like using echoes to map out the inside of a cave. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward for a nice, simple crystal, right? But what happens when you've got a really complex sample? Like, say, a rock with a whole bunch of different minerals all mixed together. Well, those simple, clean signals, they get messy. Really messy. And yeah, this is what that mess looks like in the real world. This is a real diffraction pattern. It's not just a few nice, clean peaks. It's more like a dense forest of them, all overlapping and jumbled together. Trying to figure out which peak belongs to which mineral in there, it's incredibly difficult. This was a classic problem that, for years, made analyzing complex stuff a massive headache for scientists. So how in the world do we solve this puzzle? Well, we use an incredibly clever mathematical approach called the Rietveld Method. Now, instead of trying to pick out individual trees in that messy forest of peaks, the Rietveld Method does something much smarter. It uses a computer to basically guess what the pattern should look like based on the minerals we think are in there. Then it mathematically overlays that perfect theoretical pattern on top of our messy, measured one until it gets the best possible fit for the entire thing. And this full pattern fitting approach, it is an absolute game changer. Seriously, it can slice right through those badly overlapped peaks with no problem. It also helps minimize errors that pop up just because of the way tiny crystal grains are facing. And get this, it can even spot tiny amounts of other materials, little minor ingredients you didn't even know were hiding in your sample. What it all boils down to is this: the Rietveld method gives us the super accurate, super precise picture of a material structure, even when we're dealing with the most complicated mixtures out there. Okay, so that's our architect, XRD, meticulously mapping out how a material is built. But you know, that's only half the story, isn't it? To really get the full picture, we also have to know what ingredients went into the mix in the first place. And for that, we need to turn to our second expert, the chemist, otherwise known as X-ray fluorescence, or XRF. Now, XRF is a completely different kind of tool. It honestly couldn't care less about crystal structure. You can throw solids at it, liquids, crystalline stuff, non-crystalline stuff, it doesn't matter. Its one and only job is to identify and count the atoms of every element present. We're talking everything from fluorine all the way up to uranium on the periodic table. And the way it works is just fascinating. So here's the play-by-play. First, you blast the sample with a powerful X-ray. That initial blast is strong enough to knock an electron right out of an atom's inner circle. Now you've got an empty spot, right? A vacancy? Well, an electron from a higher up, outer shell immediately drops down to fill that gap. As it falls, it releases a little burst of energy, and that burst is a secondary X-ray, what we call a fluorescent X-ray. And here is the magic part. The energy level of that fluorescent X-ray is a totally unique fingerprint for each element. The signal from a copper atom will always be different from an iron atom signal, no exceptions. And because it's so good at just figuring out what's in something, you find XRF being used absolutely everywhere. I mean, it's in factories making sure steel and cement have the perfect chemical recipe. Geologists are out in the field with it, hunting for valuable ores. It's used for sorting scrap metal by forensic teams to analyze evidence. You can even use it to check the sulfur in diesel fuel to make sure it's meeting environmental rules. It's fast, it's versatile, and it doesn't destroy the sample. It's just a total workhorse, which is why it's such a critical tool in so many industries.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got the architect, XRD, that sees structure. And we've got the chemist, XRF, that sees ingredients. They're both incredibly powerful, for sure, but they answer fundamentally different questions. So, how do you know which one to pick for the job?
All right, this table really lays it all out pretty clearly. Let's walk through it. For what it analyzes, XRF is all about the elemental composition, while XRD is looking at the crystalline structure. Simple enough. For sample type, XRF is super flexible, solids, liquids, whatever. But XRD, it really only works with crystalline materials. And then there's the detection limit, and this is a big one. XRF is insanely sensitive. We're talking parts per million. XRD, on the other hand, usually needs a phase to make up at least, say, 1 to 5% of the sample before it can even see it. So, to put it as simply as possible, XRF finds out what elements are present, and XRD finds out how those atoms are arranged.
So, it all comes down to the core question you're asking. If you just need to know, hey, what elements are in this thing and how much of each, you need the chemist. You need XRF. But if your question is more like, okay, I know there's carbon in here, but how is it arranged? Well, that's when you call in the architect, XRD. And that carbon example is perfect. XRF would just tell you, yep, there's carbon. It's XRD that tells you whether that carbon is arranged as soft, flaky graphite or as an ultra-hard diamond. Same exact element, but a totally different structure and completely different properties.
So, after all that, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, so which one's better, the architect or the chemist? And the answer is neither. This isn't a competition at all. The real power, the most complete picture, comes when you actually use them together.
There's a quote that sums this whole thing up perfectly. XRD gives molecular information, and XRF gives elemental information. I mean, that's it, right there. One is the list of ingredients. The other is the set of assembly instructions. Put them together, and you get the complete story of the material.
And that's why these two aren't rivals. They're partners, true partners in understanding materials. For example, an XRF scan might tell a geologist, hey, this soil is loaded with iron. Great, but is that iron locked up in the mineral hematite or is it in magnetite? Those are two very different things. Only XRD can tell you that. You need both pieces of that puzzle to get the full picture.
So, by combining these two amazing forms of X-ray vision, we can unlock the true identity of pretty much any material on the planet. And that knowledge, that's what allows us to build stronger alloys, create more effective medicines, and develop more sustainable technologies. We have the tools to see what was once completely unseen. So the only real question left is, what are we going to build with that power?